It's one of the most stable countries in the Middle East and a key ally of the US, but Jordan is in crisis. The kingdom is nearly $40 billion in debt and asking for aid. And this month, the Prime Minister was removed after his efforts to reduce the budget deficit sparked anti-government protests. How will Jordan survive this political and social unrest? You're watching Roundtable with me, Shuli Ghosh. Just a few months ago, NATO praised Jordan's contribution to regional and international security. It's seen as an oasis, while conflict and unrest continue to plague Syria, Iraq and Yemen. But the kingdom is facing deep political and economic problems which are threatening its stability. It's one of the most stable countries in the Middle East. But recent protests and the resignation of the Prime Minister have seen the world's eyes on Jordan. But have the protests and a government shake-up changed anything? It was the announcement of a tax increase which led to some of the largest anti-government protests in Jordan's history. But the tax increase was the latest in a long list of living standard complaints. Jordanians have been protesting almost weekly since January this year. Bread prices doubled, electricity costs went up 55%, and 18.5% of the population is unemployed, while 20% are on the brink of poverty. Adding to the economic stress are hundreds of thousands of refugees. Thousands come from neighbours Iraq and Syria, which also pose other challenges. Jordan occupies a central strategic location between Israel and Saudi Arabia, two of the region's leading powers. Israel does not want a power vacuum and will do what it can to keep Jordan stable. The kingdom is also a valuable partner for the US and its interests. On the fifth day of protests, Prime Minister Hani Mulki resigned, and King Abdullah brought in Education Minister and former World Bank economist Omar Al-Razaz.
ما بيهمناش تغيير الأشخاص بقدر ما بيهمنا السياسة اللي بتنتهجها الحكومة، إنه كل ما تصطدم في مشكلة على طول تتوجه لجابة المواطن. إحنا نتمنى على الحكومة الجديدة إنه ما يكون جابة المواطن ملاذ للحكومة.
It's unclear how radical Mr. Razaz will be allowed to be in response to the country's economic and political crisis, as any reforms have to go through the royal family, who have the final say on all policy issues. With calls to fight corruption and implement economic reforms with more consideration for the country's struggling poor and middle class, what change can Omar Razaz bring to struggling Jordanians? How effective can he be as the Prime Minister when the monarchy has the final say? If Jordan cannot keep the peace at home, will the Middle East also suffer the consequences? Well, joining us now from Leiden in the Netherlands is Violet Benneker, who researches politics and human rights in Jordan at Leiden University. In Amman is Lina Ejeilat, co-founder and executive editor of Hiba.com, a Jordanian online magazine. We also have Hanaa Hasan, researcher and journalist at Middle East Monitor, and Ghassan Al-Utaibi, Middle East Affairs commentator and policy advisor, with me in the studio. Good to have all of you with us. Lina, let me start with you, because Jordan is seen as one of the most stable countries in the Middle East. Did it take everyone by surprise when those protests and strikes that began at the beginning of the year became so widespread and so large?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that even though things had been boiling up and frustration was building up in the country with all of these, one after the other austerity measures and, policy decisions from the government, but still the size of the protests, beginning of June, I would say took everybody by surprise. And yeah, was not seen, I think, since 2012, fairly.
And in the short term, the protesters got what they wanted, but there are still huge problems ahead, aren't there?
Yes, I would say the protesters got partially what they wanted, and I think it's very interesting to point out that even though the protesters demanded, the dismissal of the government, but they also insisted on the reversal of a lot of the economic measures that had been decided. And so even when the king dismissed the prime minister, protests continued for 3 days until the new prime minister vowed to withdraw the proposed tax bill.
So, Violet, King Abdullah managed to avert an immediate crisis, but do you see a difficult road ahead because they still have to solve this economic issue, which Jordan is still in the grip of?
Well, I mean, I think this is a very complex matter indeed, and I'm not even sure whether the government knows how to move ahead at this point. Because they did make promises to the IMF, and I am wondering how they can pursue an economic reform agenda, without allowing the Jordanians a real say in how their country is run. I mean, if you talk about economic reform, tax reform, you're going to need to talk about political reform as well. I mean, if there is one rule in politics, it's that the one who pays is usually the one also who wants to decide, and that rule applies to Jordanians as well. If they have to pay, they will want to decide how that money is spent. But at this moment, I find it very hard to tell whether the government is actually willing to face that reality.
Hanaa, I can see you nodding there. How do you think the new government is going to deal with these issues and still maintain stability?
I think it's going to be very difficult, Julie. I mean, we are talking about long-term structural economic problems that have been the result of 2 decades worth of economic mismanagement on the part of the government. We've got rising unemployment amid these austerity measures. And just to put into context what kind of austerity measures we are looking at, we've seen a 55% rise in the price of fuel price of electricity in February. We've seen a 5-fold rise in the price of fuel since January this year.
This has meant a lot of hardship for people.
This has meant a lot of hardship, and this is amid rising unemployment, especially for young people and for graduates. At the moment, 1 in every 4 almost young people is looking at long-term unemployment, and the government really needs to look at beyond just stemming these protests for the time being and actually think how they're going to resolve these deep structural issues.
I mean, and the government has got this deal with the IMF, but this is going to take a number of years, right? So it doesn't look as though the new government is coming up with any alternatives other than to follow the austerity measures demanded by the IMF. What is that going to mean in Jordan?
Successive governments in Jordan for the last maybe even 40 or 50 years rather than 20 years have been unable to deal with the economic situation for a number of reasons. That's why prime ministers who have been coming into government and going out, including the last prime minister, have been unable to do anything in light of the huge debt and the huge borrowing that takes place.
Why is it so bad?
It's bad because there's a lot of mismanagement of economic and financial files over the years. And the main reason for this is the chronic and widespread corruption at the highest levels in Jordan that has been accumulating over the last 40, 50 years that actually culminated in Jordan now having $40 billion debt.
And this is what a lot of the protesters were saying, that the corruption was starting at the top and this was one of the problems that led to Jordan's problems.
Because with this corruption, so much money and resources are wasted and the coffers of the government are empty. I had good experience with many of the big corporation, government institutions in Jordan, public sector departments, who at one point in time used to have some extra cash in their coffers, and now they don't have anything. Look at, for instance, at Amman municipality. Well, it used to be one of the richest institutions because it collects all the revenues from, for instance, council taxes, from other licenses, from fines, traffic fines, everything else. They don't have money. Tax department doesn't have money. The potash doesn't have money. The phosphate doesn't have money. And when you look, the Jordan Petroleum Refinery doesn't have money. So where's the money going? And when we look at, for instance, this year's budget of 9 billion of expenditure, 7 billion of those 9 billion are current expenditure. Most of it are spent on salaries and retirement pensions for government employees.
And it's clear that that's something that the IMF is deeply worried about. So the IMF is demanding that there are these economic reforms. The interesting thing about the protests in Jordan are that you were talking about the price rises and the lack of the government subsidies which were removed, which affected the very poor. The tax reforms that were brought in were affecting the middle classes. So suddenly you had whole stratas of Jordanian society coming out in protest. Is that how it seemed to you, Lina?
Yes, I mean, I think definitely because, you know, at the beginning of the year, we did see rising fuel prices. We did see expanding the value-added tax to include basic goods that really affect lower income people, but we did not see protests of this size. The protests, I think, were sparked by the middle class and upper middle class joining in those protests because they're affected by the tax bill. And then this created momentum, and I think this is important. But I would also add and agree with what has been said, that the protesters at some point, you know, did say that we need a different approach. So this is not just about economic policy. This is not just about changing, you know, governments and prime ministers. And we cannot keep saying that the government is responsible, because really governments in Jordan come and go, and everybody knows where the buck stops. And
yeah,
I think
it's the king. The king appoints
exactly.
some of the key ministers, and the king appoints the prime minister.
And we see this whole like good cop, bad cop thing just play out again and again and again. And we've seen it in 2011. You know, people protested, they dismissed the prime minister, but nothing really changed. So, you know, people have been saying we want a different approach, but I think it's just a timid way of saying.
What do you mean by different approach? Do you mean democracy?
You know, it's interesting. I'm saying this because this was a term that was used by protesters, and everybody felt that, you know, they're just kind of going indirectly at saying, you know, there needs to be accountability. Yes, you know, those who govern need to be held accountable. And so the system just cannot go on the way it's been going on for the past, God knows how many years.
Violet, I know that you've done a lot of research in this area. How is the king perceived in Jordan? And is there worry over some of the constitutional changes we've seen over the last few years, which have given him more power?
Yeah, well, I definitely agree that people are worried, and I also agree with what Lina has said, is that, you know, usually when the king is faced by protest or is forced to change his course on the policies he's made, is that he has two strategies. The first is dismissing the government. Well, this is something that, you know, Lina already addressed. But I think the second thing he usually does is start up these so-called national dialogues. And we've seen over the course of 20 years, we've seen so many of these initiatives. We saw it happening in 2002. It was called the Jordan First Committee. 2005, a National Agenda Committee. During the Arab Spring, it was a National Dialogue Committee. And in recent years, we've seen so-called discussion papers, which were meant to open up dialogue on, for instance, the civil state. But, you know, the problem with these dialogues is that it has never led to any real change for the people on the ground. And usually these dialogues or these committees started off very promising. Sometimes these committees even discussed, you know, a truly representative new electoral law. But all of those initiatives have usually ended up being blocked by a, you know, I'd say perhaps traditional elite from within the system. And that elite just wasn't prepared to give up their privileged positions.
So there doesn't look as though there's any huge change in Jordan's direction. Do we think then that this could be a tipping point for Jordan, that the recent protests we've seen, now that the protesters have discovered their power, that they can get a tax bill withdrawn through the power of protest, could it lead somewhere else?
I think there's a possibility in the long term that protesters may use this incident to their advantage. But for the moment, I mean, people have been comparing it to the Arab uprisings of 2011 and saying, is Jordan now going to have its own Arab Spring?
Because, of course, that's how it did start, economic protests in Egypt and Tunisia, and look where it led.
Definitely. But I think that Jordanians, more than perhaps any other people, are aware of where a revolution could lead to. I mean, they've got Syria on their doorstep. They've had to take in some 660,000 refugees, and really the number is estimated at over 1 million. I think they'd be wary of what an uprising could turn into. What might be more likely is what we've seen across North Africa, because obviously the economic problems that we're talking about in terms of Jordan are not unique at all. I mean, just earlier this month, we saw in Tunisia that there was popular protest again over IMF-backed austerity measures. In Morocco, there's a month-long boycott going on of big producers of milk, bottled water and fuel over rising prices. And even in Egypt, there have been protests over a hike in metro fares. And Egypt is a country where it's actually illegal to have a gathering of about 10 or more people in one place. So these people are risking arrest to protest these price rises.
Agree with this?
I agree to a certain extent, because Jordan has a unique position in that equation. It's a buffer zone to Israel. The Israelis, through certain understandings and memos that have been signed over the years, see Jordan as a strong alliance with the king at the helm. However, excluding those external political factors, because Jordan doesn't have much to do to change them, because, as you said earlier, Jordan is an ally of the United States. It's an ally of the orbit where the United States, Israel, certain Gulf countries are in.
Important
it sees its role in this alliance, and it cannot go out to the unknown, Russia, Turkey, Iran.
So how worried would, for example, the US or Israel be if there started to become signs that there was more of a popular uprising?
Yes, I say the ceiling is getting higher and the demands of the people are getting higher, because the gap between the haves and have-nots is so big now that the middle class is being eroded, and there are people who have so much money and jobs and everything else, and people who don't have any money, they are in debt to the banks, they don't have any income, their kids are unemployed. Situation. I think my view is going to be that the king has two choices. Either he changes the way he runs the country, okay, total, I would say a complete change, where he actually starts with building more democratic institutions, giving more freedom to people to talk, more social justice, more freedom.
What's the alternative?
The alternative, he has to go, or he will go.
Oh,
not necessarily. Not necessarily. I'm saying I'm not necessarily.
Go on, Lina.
Not necessarily the Hashemite regime, but the king himself. If he's not up to the internal strife, he's not up to dealing with it properly, rather than giving cosmetic changes, like Violet said, he has to either do it right or leave. There's no other choices.
What do you think of that, Lina?
But the thing is, Jordan, I mean, while I agree in principle that, things are volatile, and, you do need, real, genuine democratic changes for things to be more sustainable. But the truth is, Jordan has seen these volatile situations over and over and over. And the truth is, yes, the Jordanian regime is backed by, not just the US, but, we've seen Saudi Arabia and Gulf countries led by Saudi Arabia jump in right after the protests to, pledge 2.5 billion in aid to Jordan. And, I think we've seen Saudi Arabia support, I would say, the counter revolutions everywhere, in the Arab world. And so, there's so many regional powers and international powers that have an interest in Jordan's stability. So unfortunately, there's always this buying time, and I think to be honest, even though this last wave of protests was really big and it took everybody by surprise, but I think we're not going to see any changes, in the near future, and we're not going to see more protests.
What about Violet's point that when people are asked to pay more taxes, they generally want more representation?
Of course, and I do agree that people are more frustrated in Jordan, and they do realize, people know where the problem lies. But at the same time, we're in a very unstable region. Like Violet said, people are worried. They look at what happened in Syria, or was it Hanaa who said that? Sorry. That people look at what's happening around us in the region, and there's always this anxiety, how far can you go with, with popular protests? So, I mean, I do think that, yes, this situation is not sustainable, but at the same time, I think that the Jordanian regime is always, successful at buying time and postponing crisis into the future.
So do the rest of you agree with that there will be maybe protests to a certain point, but it won't boil over into the kind of revolutions we've seen in other countries?
I think keeping the balance between buying time forever and something happening, okay, where security and stability become secondary issue to poverty, for instance, or economic hardship for people, that might tip the balance against the government, against the Jordanian state, into either acting into really real measures or losing control. And I feel the way things are going, the way they've been going for so many years now, people had enough.
Let me bring Violet in. What do you think of that point, that at a certain point, Jordanians will have enough, and this could be enough to demand greater democratic changes from the monarchy?
Well, first and foremost, I'd like to say that I really agree with what Lina said, which is that, you know, and this is also how I've gotten to know the Jordanians, is that first and foremost, they are very aware of the very dire situation of their neighbors, for instance, in Syria, and that this, you know, kind of makes them a bit reluctant to go out on the streets, which means the fact that they were out on the streets shows how difficult the situation has really become. And I think, you know, this argument doesn't only go for the Jordanians. I think also the Hashemite regime is very aware of what happened to other regimes in the region and how difficult their situation has become. And, you know, I would like to say, if King Abdullah turns out to be willing to not go for that, you know, the most terrible scenario, Jordan has all the structures in place that are needed to develop into a more open system. You know, it has a highly educated population. The parliament is already there. There is a senate. There is a government. And if the king is willing, he can create this much longer term stability for his, you know, for his own people, but also for his throne, by finally allowing Jordanians a real say through the institutions that are already there.
Okay, so let's talk about Omar al-Razaz, the man who is now the Prime Minister. Are we saying that he's not going to be able to make ultimately any difference because in the end all decisions have to go through the king?
I think it remains to be seen, but I think looking at him as an individual, his perspective on the whole issue would be interesting. From what we know about him, he's obviously former education minister who's now been promoted to prime minister, but he's also a Harvard-educated World Bank economist.
Right, and he's very westernised, and he's been touted as a man who can speak to international donors.
Yes, definitely. And you know, when you look at the World Bank as an institution, obviously it follows the same formula that the IMF does in terms of what needs to be done to promote growth and development. And even this week, we heard him announce that, you know, Jordan will go ahead with austerity measures, and although he has pledged economic reform and to reevaluate what those reforms will be, it's all very vague at the moment.
How is he going to sell it to the people?
I think this is what will be interesting to see. I mean, the alternative to what we're seeing right now is that the initial income tax proposals that caused the protests will be passed, but rather instead of in a block, they'll be passed in a piecemeal kind of way, slowly, and that will provoke less public outrage than what we've been seeing with the past few weeks.
Is that the view in Oman, Lina, that the austerity measures will go ahead, and how might that affect people in Jordan? Are we going to see more protests?
I agree with Hanaa that I think austerity, I mean, Jordan is still committed to the IMF program, and I don't think any government has any mandate to change that. But at the same time, I think they will be able to slow down the pace of some of these measures. And that's what I meant by, you know, it's going to buy time, that it's going to maybe slowly absorb people's frustration and anger. And I mean, I do agree with what Ghassan said, that, you know, yes, the situation is becoming harder and harder for people. And I do think that, you know, obviously the king is not going to give away any of his absolute power without feel pressure, but I wonder how far this pressure can go in light of, you know, regional allies pumping some liquidity every once in a while to try to buy the Jordanian government some time.
Yeah, do you agree with that, Violet, that at the end of the day, there is going to have to be change in Jordan, and I wonder how closely allies like the US and Israel will be watching those changes. We've seen the US leaping in with a pledge of more aid. There is a vested interest in keeping Jordan the way it is at the moment and keeping it on an even keel and keeping the monarchy in place.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm happy you bring up these other actors, because these have always been very important for, funding the Jordanian state as it was. And, this is why I think, on the whole, the idea of economic reform in itself, the paying of taxes in itself, is not necessarily a bad idea, but only if it's spread evenly, part of a comprehensive program, that makes everybody pay evenly, fights corruption, and creates jobs. Because Jordan has always been very dependent on these other international donors, as you mentioned. And this is why tax reform, only if it's done well, would mean the country will get a little bit of more freedom to decide on its own course, especially its own course in international politics. And, given the way politics are currently developing in the region, I think that would be a good thing for Jordan and for the Jordanians.
Well, it's clear that the King and the new Prime Minister all have a tricky road to navigate ahead, and we wait to see what happens. Thank you very much indeed, all of you, for joining me on this edition of Roundtable. That's it from us. Until next time, bye for now.